Welcome to another episode of the Being Human and Doing Psychotherapy podcast, where I'm trying to parse out what are all the uh, therapeutic parts that we can find in ourselves, but
Mhm.
also what are the human and messy parts that we might hide behind the role of a therapist. And tonight, I'm really happy to be joined by Lisa Marchiano. Am I pronouncing it well?
Mhm. Mhm.
And I normally say something why I think why I invite my guests, and it's usually my impression rather than your biography, which is I was quite well, I'm a listener of the This Jungian Live podcast as well, but also I read the book Motherhood. And I think as I was reading the book, there was a lot of vulnerable sharing of
Mm.
your own experiences, of the humanness of the experience, of the imperfection of the experience of being a mother. And I think I was impacted by that, by the down to earthness of your being. And I think that's basically what attracted me to invite you here. So welcome.
Thanks. It's nice to be here.
I normally start the podcast by asking the question, what are some words that you identify yourself with? So what
Mhm.
is this something that, yeah.
I guess aspirationally, curious and open and thoughtful, maybe.
Mm. And which of those was the hardest to cultivate?
Mm. Well, I think I'm always cultivating. I think I'm always cultivating all of them. But, curiosity, I think, is such an important value, whether we're a therapist, I mean, both in our therapeutic practice, but also just in terms of how we deal with ourselves. So I think turning toward anything that we initially have a judgmental feeling about, turning toward it with curiosity, like I said, with clients, but also especially within ourselves, I think is hard but important.
Hmm. And if we backtrack before you became a therapist, what's your origin story?
Mhm, mhm. Well, I the first few years out of college, or actually well, it was really actually more like a decade. I worked in the field of international humanitarian assistance. So I worked for a refugee organization, and I worked in the headquarters. I spent some time in the former USSR in
Mm,
Moscow, actually, and I also spent 2 years working in Bosnia during the
mm.
90s when the
That's
war was going
interesting.
on there.
I'm actually from Yugoslavia, so
Are
I'm
you?
yeah, I'm by origin Macedonian, and
Aha.
I'm born in the 90s when the war was happening.
Wow.
And yeah, I did not
Uh-huh.
know that.
Yeah.
That is really interesting. I
Mhm.
would like to hear more.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry.
I spent time in both Croatia and Bosnia. So I was in Split and Tuzla and
Hmm.
Sarajevo. And so anyway, yes, we'll have to check in
So,
about that.
well, actually, I let's make a pause here, and I am wondering. I think it's an unusual experience to be able to go to the, well, I call it East.
Hmm.
Not it's Easter, more Eastern for you, but what do you think has that experience um showed you, or like
Yeah. Yeah.
what was that? Because I think it's experientially a very interesting region, and
Hmm.
I'm wondering, what did you see as someone who has came from the
Yep.
outside?
Well, gosh, there's a lot I could say. I mean, first of all, I remember how different some of the cities in Croatia felt from some of the cities in Bosnia. So
Mm,
there was a time where I spent most of my time in Split, which is an absolutely beautiful city. It's so just the architecture is just so gorgeous, and it's right there on the Adriatic and everything. But
Mm.
then everyone that worked for my organization, the place we all loved to go to was Sarajevo, which at the time was, it was being shelled by the Serbs, and it was difficult to get to, and it was kind of a mess, and there was often nema struja and no hot water, but we all loved going there, and I used to try to understand like why, what was the difference, and I remember just hearing people laughing on the street in Sarajevo. There was just this kind of openness and this kind of, it just had this joy to it that always made me really curious. Like, what is that? What is that kind of cultural difference? And I think, Sarajevo was a much beloved place before the war, as I'm sure you know.
Mm.
Everyone, the people who went there, the athletes that went there in the Winter Olympics, whenever that was, a million years ago now, all talked about how much they loved it. And I got it once I spent time there. I think it was in a way, very cosmopolitan city. It was a real mix of different kinds of
Yeah.
people. And I think that just made it have this very different kind of feel to it. And you just
Mm.
hear, kind of like I said, laughter ringing on the streets as you walked about. And so that was an interesting, because they're not that far apart, but they felt so very different.
Mm.
And then in terms of, myself personally, I went there, obviously, you work in that field because you want to help people, you want to make a difference. There was this terrible thing going on. I thought I could help somehow. And I got a little disillusioned there because the nature of the work, in fact, was so political. And I got kind of cynical about it after a while, because I think in a sense, NGOs are sometimes kind of used for political reasons. And I think that happened with our group too. And also, um, it's not funny, but I was there when Garajda fell.
Mm.
And, had been a UN safe zone, but the UN protection of the city had no teeth in it. And the Serbs overran it, and they killed all the men and boys, and sent the women and the old people across the border into Bosnian Serb-held territory. And what my organization did was wrote a grant proposal to buy toiletries, to buy soap and toothpaste, and of course, those people needed things like that, and
Mm.
we gave them to them, and we gave them a place to stay and that kind of thing. But it seemed like such a pale response to what had happened.
Yeah.
So I think, I was relatively young at the time. I was about 30, and here I was kind of grappling with meaning and justice and cruelty and all of this stuff. And I thought, I don't know that, not that buying soap isn't important, but I
Yeah.
don't know that it's quite the thing.
Yeah.
And so it was really partly that response that made me think, I think there's something else I need to be doing.
Mm.
And so when I returned to Bosnia, that's when I actually began my pursuit to become a Jungian analyst.
Wow. I would like to, I didn't know this is where we are going
Hmm.
to go, but I actually there are still some things inside me that are
Yeah.
I'm sitting with, and one of them is my experiences of war. So I lived in Serbia at the
Hmm.
time. So I'm or by origin Macedonian, but I lived in Serbia.
Okay.
And my experience of war is how dirty it is, and how
Mm-hmm.
on the outside it's quite, you can see two sides, you can see, but on the inside, as you're now saying, it's just much more complex, and much more complex, the influences that no one can really see unless you're deeply in it. And interestingly, I was recently listening to a lecture of someone who was, I don't exactly remember, but I think he was the president of the Red Cross at a
Hmm.
certain point. And connected to what you said, that I needed to become a Jungian analyst, I always thought like there is something about going away from the pain that the people are experiencing
Hmm.
and throwing money at them. Um, that is quite dehumanizing, but it
Hmm.
looks like help.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
don't know if that's what you experienced, but that's, I think, what I was feeling is that it's easy to give someone a present, but most of the time it's connection that
Hmm.
people need in moments of distress.
Hmm.
And that I think is much more difficult to give, or at least it's not structurally implemented, or at least not
Hmm.
to my knowledge. But I was only a participant, never really someone who was on the outside. So I'm wondering what's your view
Yeah,
now with
yeah.
this distance and with that experience.
Well, yeah, I can relate to a lot of what you're saying. First of all, in terms of it being dirty, I think what you're trying to say is so there really are no good guys.
Mm,
And
mm.
I mean I definitely or that there are no pure motivations maybe
Yes.
because there certainly are bad guys,
Yes. Yeah.
but when you're really in the trenches, it's like, oh, nobody here is the good guy. There, yes,
Mhm.
there might be bad guys, but nobody's really the good guy here.
Yeah.
So there is something just almost just so compromising about it. But what you're saying about what people really need. I mean, that was another experience for me is not just in garage, but I got to know locals there that worked for us, right? And so one woman that I became friends with, she really intelligent, thoughtful young woman, and she was very unhappy,
Mm,
and what she was unhappy about was she was lonely. And and there were it wasn't just her. There were other people like that too. I was like, oh, it's not the thing that th- there is no sort of international fix to the problems because these are just people having problems like they do everywhere. She wanted a partner. She wanted a boyfriend. She was very, very lonely and she worried she'd never find someone, which
mm,
is something that people experience all over the world in all kinds of different situations, and there isn't a relief agency that's going to fix that.
yeah.
So I remember because at that point I was planning on going to law school. I wanted to work in international human rights law, and so I was supposed to go back and go to law school. And I remember talking. There was a psychologist there who was involved in some of the programs we were doing, and I was talking to him, and he said to me, "If you're interested in power, go to law school. If you're interested in truth, become a psychologist." And I thought, well, that's just the most pat, oversimplified thing, but
Mm.
it's stuck with me. It's stuck with me, and I still think about that. So,
Yeah. Just this morning, I read a therapist who wrote that therapy is being cured by truth.
oh my
So
gosh.
it very much
Wow.
resonates with what you've just said, and it
Oh, I
really
really like
resonated.
that.
Yeah, it really resonated with my whole being as I read it, because
Hmm. Hmm.
it does yeah um
That's great. I like that a lot.
yeah and so after seeing that, what from that did you take with you, going back from that experience, going back home, and then starting your journey as an analyst?
Yeah, well, I think in some sense it was maybe some of the things we've already touched on, like how difficult it is to uh well what you were saying before about how it's dirty, and I was saying there are no good guys, it's that Solzhenitsyn line about the line between good and evil runs right through the center of your heart.
Mm.
So just just having to grapple with um the ways that my being there were selfish and self-serving, say, and so I guess what I'm really talking about is what Jung would call the shadow,
Mm.
yeah, I was there trying to help, but just like everyone else on the planet, I have my shadowy sides. And also, again, going back to my friend who wanted a lover, just the universality of suffering, how we're just not so very different from one another, even in such very different circumstances.
Mm.
Which is something, of course, I knew at some level, but it was just recognizing it on another level.
Mm. And also, just for me, the experience as well is what you've mentioned, joy, and that's something I think I'm bringing from the region, which I'm grateful for, is
Hmm.
that I don't know, the capacity, how close are the capacity for grief and joy?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I don't know, Macedonia is kind of similar. There is a lot of sorrow, but what I'm bringing is also like a huge capacity to be then joyful
Hmm.
for the things
Yeah.
that we do have and hold the sorrows. So what I
Hmm.
really liked is that um things were not easily put in the shadows. In
Hmm.
it was a little bit uh bipolar, like in the sense of going into extremes, but in a
Hmm.
way then it's a kind of expanding through polarity.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I could see that, the kind of the
Yeah.
cultural character there. There was a lot of passion.
Yes.
Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hmm.
Vital spark.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. And then the journey of becoming a Jungian analyst, I remember from the book you're mentioning that it's kind of overlapping with your experience becoming a mother.
Hmm.
And I'm just wondering, what were the most kind of um challenging parts of that journey?
Becoming an analyst.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, I mean, boy, it's a long road. It takes most people, at least where I trained, it took me 8 years of active training, and it takes plenty of people longer than that. So it's a big commitment. And there are usually really everyone reaches some kind of difficult passage along the way somewhere where
Mm.
you're struggling with an exam or an assignment, or you're butting heads with a particular analyst who doesn't want to help you move forward. I think that for me, it was mostly filled with just a lot of joy. Honestly, it was deeply meaningful to have this cohort and be sharing these ideas together. But it was expensive. It costs a lot of money. Um, and there is this feeling that, will I ever get through? Will this have made sense to spend all of this time, energy, and money on this once I am through? Is it kind of worth
I can
it?
so much relate to that.
Yeah. So, but
Yeah.
I mean, I kind of enjoy school, so that academic part of it wasn't hard. And then of course, though, it's not just an academic enterprise. It really is about digging into yourself, and there's the training analysis, and maybe the hardest part about it, if I'm going to try to sum it up, what has to do with what I talk about in the new book that's coming out in about a month, which is claiming my authority, which I also talk about in motherhood,
Yeah.
because that's been a
Mhm.
lifelong journey for me. And training really forced me to grapple with that. And I did get a lot better with it. It's still a work in progress. I'm still working on it. But training helped me a lot with that. And it forced me to have to figure that out.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I always say this, so people who are listening regularly will know that. But I get this. So it's almost like people come into my field exactly at the stage where I need to hear something. And what you're just saying is, I interviewed someone last Friday, and we were talking about entrepreneurship and
Hmm.
uh, being in private practice, and what does that mean? And how that is kind of almost an individuation act. And the lady I interviewed, she said it's stepping into your voice and into your
Yes.
authority.
Yes.
And it is really, I mean, it really opens up all the places where you kind of stopped yourself from
It
having a voice and having an
absolutely does.
authority.
Yes.
And it's at times gut and heart-wrenching to go through
Hmm.
that.
Hmm.
So I'm wondering, maybe what do you remember anything a specific that you can share about that?
Yeah, and I actually talk about it briefly in the new book, The Vital Spark, because um, I was a good student when I was a young person. I did well in high school. school and I did well in college and I did well in graduate school and I it was a very easy place for me to go to just like be the good student. And part of that archetype is you're seeking approval. So you're looking for approval in the student role. And so I had at one point I had this colloquium with this analyst. There were a bunch of us were talking about cases, and I went in my good student mode, unquestioningly, like this is all unconscious, right? I'm not aware that that's how I'm approaching this. But I go in and I'm looking for this analyst to like me and approve of me. And like almost right away, things started kind of going south. And I was floored. Like, this is not usual, right? Usually in this environment, people like me. But it wasn't going well, which made me get defensive, which only made it get worse.
Yeah.
And I had to do some real work around it. And I can't remember exactly what my process was. I was like, well, do I like confront this analyst and have this conversation? It's like, no, that doesn't feel right. And I had to just kind of go inside and figure this out. And it really sort of dawned on me that I was looking for something from the analyst. I was looking for this analyst to like me and approve of me. And I hadn't given a thought to
Mm,
what the analyst might need. Like the analyst is a person, they're coming in, they might need something. And in fact, what I sort of learned later, kind of figured it out, is that they felt rather inadequate and insecure in the role.
mm,
And so my coming in and being like, look at me, aren't I smart? That was exactly, the wrong thing to do. But I
mm,
wasn't thinking about them. I was only thinking about myself.
mm,
So once I kind of shifted and started thinking, okay, what do they need? And um, is that something that I can do for them?
mm,
Everything changed. And it was a lesson that I carried over into other relationships. And there's something very naive and young about going into an environment and thinking, let me show you how great I am so that you can give me, a gold star and a pat on the head.
mm.
That's first of all, that isn't really, claiming your own authority. You're in this kind of position of being a supplicant looking for
Yes.
something. But it also, in some ways, is an incredibly kind of selfish stance, or at
Mm,
least a solipsistic one. So
yeah.
that was a moment, it was like, whoa, okay, I hadn't thought about that before. And so it has to do with authority in a way, because I wasn't in a role of agency when I was just looking for approval. But
Mm,
when I could step back and think, okay, what's going on here? Oh, let me do this other thing. Then I was in this role of agency.
and then you were actually in a relationship as well.
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah. And I'm also wondering, in terms of stepping into the role of the therapist, how were you navigating that transition into being a student of therapy versus being a practitioner and a therapist?
Hmm. Well, I was already a therapist before I started analytic training.
Mm,
So you get qualified as a therapist first, and then you go into training. And in some sense, being a therapist is, I mean, that transition, out of graduate school was, terrifying, because you do carry this certain authority. But on the other hand, you can always default to being the good mother and
mm,
just being very kind of, affirming and empathic, which doesn't make you a good therapist, by the way.
yeah.
But I think that's where most of us start.
It's really interesting because this is exactly the next question I wanted to pose. So
Hmm.
maybe you finish and then I will.
Well, that's what I was going
Yeah.
to say. So,
Because that's actually it's I had a discussion with my supervisor yesterday, and I was as I was coming to the interview, what I was stuck with was the a story from your book about the porridge, and I don't remember exactly, but not
Yeah.
the mother not being able to say stop, and then
Yes.
it overflew, and only the daughter then said like, "Oh, stop cooking." And then and then everyone needed to eat their way back or something
Mm-hmm.
like that. But then and when I was speaking to my supervisor, she mentioned, I said, "Oh, I'm kind of nurturing," and she's like, "I really want to correct you here because having boundaries is nurturing.
Yes.
The other thing is just not having boundaries."
Yeah, yeah.
And I think it somehow relates to this. So
Absolutely.
maybe
Yeah.
then how were you stepping into being able to challenge in a constructive way,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and upholding boundaries
Mm-hmm.
that are also the nurturing mother, but we don't see
Well,
it as
and
like.
so the story you're referring to, it's a Grimm's, I'm pretty sure it's a Grimm story, and it's in my book Motherhood, and I'm relating it there to uh anger, basically, because
Mm,
anger, I think, is such an issue for mothers. At least it was for me, but I think it is for pretty much
yeah.
all of us. It's sort of shocking how angry you can get at your kids. And so what I was wanting to do with that story was explore, like, is there such a thing as being not angry enough? And I think that story kind of captures it. And it's, in the realm of this kind of too good mother, which definitely comes up in therapy, because I think the therapy field in general has too much positive mother and not enough positive father. And that as therapists, we need to find both, because it is appropriate, of course, to be empathic and warm and connected. But
Mm,
if we can't sometimes challenge someone or hold our own boundary or confront someone, then I don't know that we're really doing the person a service at all. In fact, I would say that we're not.
mm,
Um, and this idea does come up in my new book, The Vital Spark, because this is something that I've had to deal with, and it hasn't come easily for me. And I think that for many women, that's true. Not all women, but for many of us, we might, for example, feel anger at a certain point, but not be able to speak from that place in order to help ourselves hold a boundary or confront someone. So it's sort of because it feels like we're not supposed to, or we've told ourselves that we're not supposed to, or we feel afraid of our own anger, for
mm,
example.
mm, mm.
So I spent a lot of time in the new book talking about anger, authority, and ruthlessness, even
Oh yeah.
being able to be ruthless. I have um, you know, uh, one of my colleagues, Mark Winborn, has written a lovely paper about ruthlessness in the analytic container, and how the analyst sometimes has to be ruthless, which means that you say something even if it's going to make the other person uncomfortable. Sometimes I think about medical doctors with this, because I think in their training, they learn to disregard the patient's pain
Yeah.
hopefully in the interest of healing, right? I mean, this can become,
Mm,
sociopathic, but that ability to say, like, that the patient's wincing and the doctor keeps going because the wound has to be probed or whatever it is. And as therapists, we need to lean into that too. And it's hard for us, because usually if you're the kind of person who becomes a therapist, you don't have that side of yourself as developed.
mm, mm. I would also like to spend some time here. I think it's a very important, let's say, also I think it's a lack, a wider societal lack. I mean, talking about the war, many families have grown without
Hmm.
men and father figures. And I've noticed that I've gone I've had my own journey with reading about womanhood, and also that was an important part of the journey.
Hmm.
But then I think I'm noticing now, I'm like, oh, I need to start switching. I need to read analysts who write about the masculine now.
Hmm.
And I'm wondering, what do you mean when you say the nurturing father?
Well, I didn't say the nurturing father. I said the
What
good
did I?
father.
The good father. Okay.
hmm
Yeah.
hmm I
Interesting.
mean, I think fathers can be nurturing too, but from
Yeah.
from the standpoint, from like an archetypal standpoint,
Yeah.
good father is ordering. Good father is law giving. Good father has expectations. And of course, that this is not prescriptive. I'm not saying like, well, this is the way fathers are, should be, and mothers should be like this. But we do know that there is a natural tendency that seems to be innate. Mothers tend to modulate their speaking. They get down on the kid's level. They use words the kid will understand. In general, fathers don't do that.
Mm,
Fathers don't change the way they talk when they talk to their kids.
mm,
Mothers use that motherese, but fathers will, use more adult vocabulary and cadence. And the
mm,
kid gets both. And there's a developmental benefit to getting both.
mm,
So it's not that good mother is bad. It's not that good father's bad. It's that we need to develop as therapists or even just as people in the world. We need to develop, I think, the ability to be both good mother. Like now I know that I'm gonna, you know, get on your level, that I'm gonna be soothing. And
mm,
sometimes that no, I need to hold my boundary and I need to be confronting because,
mm.
in the interest of growth.
Yeah. Yeah. And how was it for you to embody that? And where were the growth where were the growth edges lying?
Oh, well, I would say that is still very much a work in progress. And
Yeah.
and in both my life and my clinical work, that is a sort of that is harder for me. But it is part of, what I mentioned before, claiming authority. I should say that I feel like that sort of this this thing that I'm calling masculine should be, can be, and is an innate potential within women,
Yeah.
so that there is a kind of feminine way of holding this masculine energy. It's not like we're becoming more masculine, but to be able to hold authority, to hold your ground, to step into authority, to be ruthless. It doesn't come easily for us, but it's an innate potential and we can do it. And like I said, I mean, some of this, and just in my interpersonal relationships, it's like, oh, I guess I need to stand up for myself more. Some of it in my clinical work, it's like, oh, this person's not really benefiting because I'm not challenging them.
Mm,
And it's just something you just keep working on.
mm. And I'm wondering there, so there is this book which I like, it's called The Devil You Know, and it's a
Hmm.
forensic psychiatrist. And she writes in that a lot of what's shown as masculinity in this day and age is basically toxic masculinity. And
hmm
so I'm wondering how much of us not being able to access our own ruthlessness is by not having models of how that looks like in a good father,
hmm
and what we associate with ruthlessness, structure, expectations, we actually associate with something that is quite damaging. And therefore, it's difficult to access it within ourselves. So I'm just wondering, where are you
hmm
maybe finding your models, or yeah, finding someone to model that is not a destructive but constructive force inside you.
Well, I mean, so first of all, I would say that, the masculine or the feminine or the mother or the father, if we
Yeah.
think about them archetypally, every archetype has a positive pole and a negative pole.
Mhm.
So the positive pole of the father is structuring, law giving, ordering, you know, gentle push out into the world, uh, you know, um, kind of toughen up, you know,
Mhm.
get at, it's a little bit stoic. Negative father is a tyrant,
Yeah.
right? Positive mother is loving, nurturing, soft, warm. Negative mother is smothering and devouring.
Mm.
So, but we don't talk in this culture much about toxic femininity in the
Femininity.
archetypal sense. but
Mm,
I think it's all around us, actually.
yes.
I think in cultural movements, for example, or cultural trends that encourage us, for example, to identify with victimhood, I think that's toxic femininity. It's like, oh, you poor thing, you
Mm,
know, not that people don't experience things that indeed victimize them, right?
mhm,
But it's look, let's put it this way. A good, and this is, this is neurobiology. This is, there's lots of evidence behind what I'm about to say. Your kid comes home and is upset, and crying. You immediately, your young child, you get down on their level, you say, honey, what's wrong? And the kid's crying, you say, oh, and you listen, and you may hug or embrace, you listen, you take it in, you're warm. After some period of time, when the emotions are better regulated, you shift and you say, and you evaluate, is there some problem solving we need to do? Do we need to take you to the urgent care? I mean, provided it's not,
yeah.
like the kid is bleeding profusely and then you go
Yes.
right to the urgent care. But, is it like, well, we need to have someone look at that? Or is this the kind of thing where you would like me to talk to your teacher? If it's a
Mm,
somewhat older child, is there an intervention needed, or is it just enough that I listened?
mm,
At some point, it might be, well, I can understand you feel really terrible. What did you do to that helped create this situation that your friends are not talking to you? Do you think it's possible that you angered them because you did X, Y, or Z? So
mm,
at some point we might confront the kid, not right away. No, not right away. That
mm,
would be very unempathic and not helpful. But
mm,
eventually, there might be any number of things that we would need to do to help that situation, and some of those would fall into good father,
yeah.
because we're either confronting or we're kind of activating them to handle something. Well, you need to go talk to your teacher, or you know, in just that way, I think that we sometimes in the culture lean too much into, it's terrible that you've been wronged. Yes, it is terrible that you've been wronged. After some period of time of marking how wronged you've been, we all need to activate into trying to fix the problem. And that means empowering the person who was wronged to do it. Not saying, well, now you're a victim, there's nothing for you to do. This is all external to you. But, what can you do to fix things? And
Yeah.
and that's not victim blaming. That's victim empowering.
Yeah. I can really much relate to this. I'm really glad I've been helped by incredible therapists to processes like that. Um, and probably having some parts of me knowing that it's something I have to do, but it
Mhm.
is a really hard thing to step into. I think what was one thing that a therapist told me, she said, it is important to recognize you have been victimized in order to
Yes.
get away from that position.
Mhm.
Uh, so we can get stuck in that, like, oh, nothing happened, and therefore not really getting in touch with the rage or anything that needs to get to the empowered
Yes.
stage.
Definitely.
But these are all stages, and I'm really glad that you
Yes.
described all the stages because I don't think many people talk about them, and you can get stuck in being a lifelong victim or being not even getting to the stage of recognizing
Yep.
you have been a victim. But it's
Yes.
really nice that you've kind of outlined them quite precisely now.
Yeah, and I think your word about stages, I think that's just right. I guaranteed someone who hears me say this will say, You're saying victims shouldn't. I'm like, no.
No.
No, come to therapy, do months of years of soothing and processing and validating and affirming. And at some point, I want you to be empowered.
Yeah.
So there's the first thing is totally necessary. If your kid came to you and was upset and you said, "What did you do to to make friends angry at you?" or "Go talk to your teacher about that," or, you know, "I don't care that you scraped
Mm,
your knee." That would be totally wrong, totally unhelpful. You have to do the nurturance first and help the person regulate and take stock of what happened and understand what happened.
Mm.
And then we can move into empowerment and agency.
Yeah. And I'm wondering, in again coming back to from the collective to the you to individual,
Mhm.
what is it that you found again challenging to when was it that it was challenging for you to step into your power,
Mhm.
to feel like actually I have agency in this situation much more than I ever imagined?
Mhm. I think for me it was, and to a certain extent continues to be, sort of that old thing about just kind of believing in yourself.
Mm.
I was like, well, I'm not a person who could ever dot dot dot,
Yeah.
write a book or something like that. And
Mhm.
so just letting myself just sort of know what I know, and
Mm.
just being able to claim that, that's been a hard thing.
Yeah. I'm just sitting also because I told you I've just finished Addiction to Perfection, and the end
Mhm.
of it, she I wouldn't be able to paraphrase this properly, but my understanding is when she was talking about being ravished and being raped,
Mhm.
and how being ravished is a state where we allow life to actually impact us
Mm.
and let it through us, whether we're being raped is when we are constantly braced, and it looks like when the life impacts us, it feels foreign, it feels unwelcomed, and therefore it feels like rape. And I
Mhm.
think it somewhat connects to the story of being a victim of life versus letting life impact us and
Oh, that's
purposely doesn't
beautiful.
comes. That's
Yes.
my understanding of what
Yeah.
you've said and what I've read, but
Yeah.
she's obviously like saying it much more eloquently and beautifully.
Mhm. Yeah. I had
But
forgotten that, but that's perfect. That's perfect. Is
mm,
kind of trusting in your own sturdiness,
yeah,
that you can let life impact you without sort of, claiming,
yeah,
without that understanding, uh that makes you a victim because you were impacted. I mean,
yeah, yeah.
this this is a little pokey, I suppose, but I feel like one place where I've seen that is uh, in childbirth, because
Mhm.
many women really want a natural childbirth, and I think that a natural childbirth movement is really so important, and it's brought back sacredness to that incredibly significant experience. And some women get so attached to the idea that they're going to have a natural childbirth that
Mm,
if they, for example, have an emergency C-section, they really experience it as a trauma.
yeah.
And that's a perfect example between kind of being raped and ravished, whereas if you had your heart set on a natural childbirth and then they call that stat section, it feels like a total violation, total loss of control, and it's quite traumatic. And some women, feel that they need therapy to deal with that
Yeah.
afterwards. Whereas if you sort of surrender to the process a bit, well, let's just say that there are other women that have stat C-sections that don't have that reaction because they
Mhm.
didn't feel like this was the most important thing, or maybe I'm not expressing it right, but
Yeah.
there's a little bit more like, well, this is going to be what it's going to be, and I can try to influence it. And I know I want a certain outcome, and I'm going to try to go for that certain outcome. And I'm getting in a big river here, and it
Yeah.
might take me somewhere that I don't know where it's going
Where
to
it's
take me
gonna
to.
take me. Yeah, it's very interesting. I am reading so there was a Serbian documentary on childbirth, and it's been a big process for me. I'm a C-section child, and it was a very interesting um like, and also I'm a daughter of a doctor, so I kind of grew
Hmm.
up with very much the medical model. So for me,
Hmm.
it was really nice to touch the other pole of
Hmm.
knowing what else exists.
Yes.
And I think it's always about holding the polarities, holding the complexity, but kind of being able to release, because I think attachment, too much attachment is like a really fertile ground for trauma and for feeling
Hmm. Hmm.
feeling raped.
Right, because it has to do with our need for control.
Yes, yeah.
And if we really are holding on tight, then
Mm,
we're more likely to feel like we were raped,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
no matter what it
Yeah,
is.
yeah, yeah. I can I can relate so much to that.
Yeah.
And maybe we can touch upon your own stories of childbirth and becoming a mom. And how has that impacted you and changed you, and how did you grow from that? I know it's probably like full podcast, but
Yeah. I mean, I think that, in some sense that is the book,
yeah,
because and I did write it because I kind of tell this story in the introduction that I had, my daughter, and then my son was born when my daughter was 2, just
yeah,
like
I
a few
remember
days
that.
before her
Yeah.
second
Yeah.
birthday. And so, so I had a toddler and a newborn. Not an unusual
Yeah.
not an unusual configuration, but a really difficult one. And I remember there was this one day, and it was just, it was cold out. There was nothing to do. There was nowhere to go. My kids would wake up at like 5 o'clock and they would just be up for the day. I was so tired. And I was like, oh my God, it's like, 7 o'clock. And I just, got everyone through breakfast, and it's going to be like another 12 hours before bedtime. Like, how am I going to do this? So I'm like, okay, let's go for a walk. So it was freezing cold, but I got everyone bundled up, which, you know how much of a pain that is to get like a toddler in a snowsuit and the baby in a snowsuit, and then get the stroller out and get everyone out. And I'm walking, and it's like bitterly cold, and we're walking, and I'm pushing the stroller, and it's so hard to push the double stroller because the sidewalks in my neighborhood are not very good. And I'm just like, God, everything about this is so hard. And then a, a kind of thought came to me, and I thought, well, I'm changing so much as a result. I'm growing so much as a result. And it was like, oh my God, of course, right? Because what makes you change? Difficult experiences. What makes you grow? What makes you expand? Difficult, challenging experiences. That's it.
Mm,
So I got really interested in that. I thought, well, how am I growing? How am I changing? And I was in analytic training at the time. I'd taken a year off because of the new baby, but it's like, well, this is an individuation opportunity. What am I learning? And that question of how does this experience influence, individuation, sort of became, I mean, it was that question that I explored. And I mean, that day that I just described happened in 2004, and my book was published in 2019. So that's a question I sat
wow.
with for a long time. Um, and what I would say is, I mean, just in a nutshell, I think it was the 3 parts of the book. The first are the different kinds of losses and the things that you have to let go of, and I talk about loss of control. The second part of the book is the shadow, which I've already referred to. I mean, that sense that I talked about before of anger. It's like, oh my God, I didn't know that I could have such cruel impulses towards the very people that I
Violence.
love most in the world. That's a confrontation with shadow right there.
Mm,
And then finally it's like, well, but look at the things that I'm claiming. And one of those that I write about in motherhood was authority, and also creativity, and then a renewed different kind of relationship, really, with spirituality. So,
mm,
and I mean, I'm sure I could have come up with many more things, but those were the
mm,
ones that kind of landed for me, that I was also seeing in my clients, and
mm.
that took shape in the book.
And interesting as you're saying this, it's really nice how as you're speaking, you're answering the questions I I kind of have. But as I was thinking this morning and reflecting on actually that moment when you were talking about not the moment you described, but the moment where you describe in the book about the rage and the children getting really scared and saying, "Mommy, could you please stop?" Um, and I was thinking, yes, the reason that children can do this is we can easily escape other relationships. And we can
Yes.
really escape doing this, um, because there is always a potential of ending that.
Hmm.
and not want, or what you don't want to face, kind of.
Mhm. Mhm.
But with this relationship, in a way, I mean, obviously there is always a potential to kind of distance yourself, desensitize, and all the range of things people do. But if you choose not to do that, then it's an incredible well of
Mhm.
finding places inside of you and new spaces inside of you. And I thought it's really incredible when it comes to children, because it's in a way a lifelong thing where you have to grow, or you can
Mhm.
choose to grow in a way. And I also was sitting with again the ravishment of that, of of the invitation to look inside
Mhm.
yourself.
Mhm. Mhm.
And obviously it's a choice to accept it or not. But I remember, and as sorry, it's just I have
Mhm.
now a lot of meaning making.
Mhm.
But also I remember, as I was going through some of my processes, someone I called my Swiss mom, she was telling me, Alex, you're growing. Alex, you're growing. Alex, you're growing. These are growing pains.
Mhm.
And somehow this changed everything.
Yeah.
uh, and it feels like the same way as you were thinking. Is how can we stay in the experience with a different perspective,
Mhm.
and suddenly the experience does not have to hurt as much, if
Right.
that makes sense.
Right. Or that it has meaning, you know.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I mean, certainly the book was inspired by my own experiences, but also, I work and I continue to, and I have worked with a lot of moms, and I think that the moms that I've worked with, just blame themselves so much, for example, for being angry. And there was a way that I really wanted to try to create space for curiosity about it.
Mm.
Just talking about curiosity before, but yeah, so that the experience, it doesn't just, you were saying, well, with other relationships you can leave, and of course you can do that with kids too, and some people do, and if it's always a good idea to get a break if you can. I'm a big fan of hire a babysitter, pass the kids off to your husband or partner, go for a walk, whatever. I'm not saying you have to, be with your kids all the time, but if you are in a pattern of choosing away from being with your kids all the time, that affects the attachment,
Yeah.
which it's not even like, oh, it hurts your kids. It hurts your attachment to them. And
Mm.
that's something to watch out for, right? That's kind of blocked parental care. And so there is really something about staying in the conflict, even when it's uncomfortable, being able to do that, being able to make meaning out of it, being able to forgive yourself when it's hard,
Mm.
and to kind of give yourself credit for hanging in there, even when you're not perfect.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. And I actually here maybe want to add one layer, which is in the fairy tales, these are fairies, but it's somehow, I think, important to have helpers when it comes to um aunts, aunties, friends. Or like, I feel like a part of, I mean, that's something I just kind of experientially through being therapized and being a therapist learned.
Mhm.
One part of that is also the client or children, they feel safe with others, and therefore it's not smothering. It's not you and me. It's not only us, and you can only get these things from
Mhm.
me. But slowly learning that there are much more resources,
Yeah.
and I'm someone you can always come back to, but I'm not all be all kind of thing.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah.
And I'm wondering, was there something for you in the journey where you found those fairy godmothers or someone to support you?
Yeah, definitely. I had my friends in training were helpful, and yeah, I had friends and others in the
Mm.
journey.
And I'm wondering another thing that's slightly part of the book, but I don't know how much, and you speak a little bit about that in the podcasts, but what about, so you were talking about mothering through birth, and many people who come in our therapy rooms cannot be mothers by giving birth. And maybe we can touch upon a little bit about what does that mean, and how can women find meaning in different ways, or mothering, being
Hmm.
mothers in different
Hmm.
ways.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, well, there for first of all, the there I mean, adoption is just a kind of endlessly fascinating and important topic, and I do mention it briefly in the book, and that, of course, is another way of being a mother. But there are other ways of being generative,
Mm.
whether that is, nurturing someone who's not a child, or kind of being in a sort of auntie role, maybe to a young person, but also having different kinds of psychic children, whether it's a creative project or a business idea, or just nurturing kind of ourselves or nurturing our relationship with ourselves. So
Mm.
I think there are lots of different ways to mother, and there are many different ways to be generative.
Mm. And one thing I didn't ask, but why Jungian therapy? What was the draw?
Well, I was not really interested in being a therapist ever until I found Jung, because the other stuff that I came across or that I had experienced didn't ring true. Whereas and I was really first introduced to Jung, really through books, which is probably one of the reasons why I wanted to write, is because that books have kind of been my portal to different things, including Jung. The first book I read was by the wonderful Jungian analyst Linda Leonard. She wrote a book called On the Way to the Wedding, and it was incredibly meaningful to me to read that book. And I thought, wow, these ideas just clarified something. It was like someone once described it, and I think it felt just right. It's like I had not spoken my mother tongue since infancy, and then I heard it again. It was it
Mm.
wasn't it wasn't absolutely it didn't absolutely feel like learning something new. It felt like recognizing something I'd always known but hadn't ever been able to articulate.
Mm.
And it's beautiful. I mean, Jungian thought is beautiful, and it emphasizes meaning, and it really is a whole worldview, which and
Mm.
much more so than I think other therapeutic schools. And
Mm.
it just seemed true to me. It just seemed true. And then the interest didn't dissipate. It just kept growing. And I was like, oh my God, I think I have to do this. So,
Okay, I can relate to that as well.
mhm, mhm.
And what has doing the podcast, this Jungian love life, or maybe love, um, um, kind of brought to you, and how has it shaped you also as a therapist? And was it difficult to give yourself the permission to start it? I don't really know the origin story of the podcast, actually.
Well, the origin story of the podcast was that someone had asked me to be on her podcast. And so I had been a podcast guest. And while I was in that process, I was like, huh, I wonder what it'd be like to have a podcast, because that's just something my brain always does. And I sat with that for a little while, and it didn't go away. And so eventually I asked Deb and Joseph, and they were like, yes, let's do it. So we started it because we thought it would be fun to have a creative project together. It was just really supposed to be fun. We said, because we had to, we had to pay for it. So we said, okay, well, we're going to make a commitment to do it for a year. We'll just do it for a year and see what happens. And then it really kind of picked up like almost right away. It was sort of shocking. Um, so that's the origin story. I mean, the podcast has probably changed my life. I mean, it's got to be up there in a list of top 10 things that can change your life. I mean, it's been remarkable. I don't know that I would have gotten the book published if I didn't have the podcast. It's really just allowed me to expand my therapeutic activities. We also have Dream School, which is an online platform where we teach people how to work with their dreams. And it's also I'm just so aware of how it has kept me learning, and I'm sure you can understand this. I mean, we don't interview people every week, but when we do, it's like, oh, got to read that book, and I'm whenever I'm reading a book, I'm like, wow, this is a great book. I want to invite this person on the
I
podcast. And
know, yeah, yeah,
so
yeah.
yeah. So a lot of opportunity for really fascinating conversations, but
Yeah.
also I just, forcing myself every week to have these, to have to try to formulate my ideas about a topic, in dialogue with two people whose minds I really respect. And, we always do a dream on the podcast. We interpret a listener's dream. And, I think I was pretty good with dreams before we started the podcast, but it's doing, because we always do two dreams. We always do the one for the podcast and then the one for Patreon. So talking in depth about two more dreams per week, again, with colleagues. It's like, well, it's really kept me very alive intellectually. And it's just great. It's such a surprise. I never thought this was going to happen when we started it. It's just been such a
Mm.
wonderful surprise.
Mm. And I mean, as well, I think the word dialogue you used is also really nice because I think it's different when one talks to a microphone, but it's completely different when it's a live thing
Hmm.
and you can course correct. And
Hmm.
I think there's a lot of learning in that as well, to be like, actually, maybe I have a different view or a different idea. And I think
Hmm.
that that is basically the space of expansion. So
Hmm.
I and I wonder maybe what was the most surprising thing for you in this journey of like um publicly being able to expose so much of your vulnerability.
I think in terms of the podcast, it's just it's shocking that it's as popular as it is because it seems like it would be pretty arcane. And I mean, we try to make it accessible. That's kind of part of the point. But I will check our podcast rankings periodically on Apple Podcasts, and we're always in like, I mean, right now we often hover around number 50 in the health and fitness, and it's like, I sometimes I'll just go, like, wow, there's like a podcast on Jungian thought in the top 100 on health and fitness. Like, who, I would never have thought that, because it's
Mhm.
I mean, Jung has had these periods of, like in the 90s, for example. You're too young to remember this, but Women Who Run with the Wolves came out, and Thomas More's Care of the Soul came out, and one of Hillman's books was a bestseller, and there were all these Jungian blockbuster bestsellers in the 90s. So I know that there's kind of, Jung has this kind of perennial interest, but in some sense, it always feels a little bit like it's, oh, I don't know, just a little bit abstruse, outside of the mainstream. And so to see so many people kind of latch on to what we're doing and be really interested in it is, it's incredibly, I'll tell you the thing that makes me just so humble and happy is that I feel like it's possible that our podcast has helped a kind of second Jungian renaissance. And
Mm.
I really feel like the man himself was not perfect. I don't sort of worship Jung, but his ideas are medicine for our culture
Yeah.
in many, many ways. And if I have played any role in helping more people learn those ideas, then I will have, I think, done what I came here to do. So
Mm.
that feels really good.
Mm. And what do you think maybe what are some of the ideas that you feel are so medicinal about
Mhm.
Jung?
Well, I mean, I think first, the idea of the shadow is incredibly, incredibly important. It's incredibly important in looking at interpersonal relationships, but also in terms of things like racism, but even in terms of world affairs. Because,
Mm.
I mean, this has relevance to, for example, how we manage to go to war with each other is because we project shadow and demonize each other. And, you know, um, Erich Neumann, a Jungian analyst and a colleague of Jung's, wrote a very important book after World War II called Depth Psychology and a New Ethic, in which he said, look, we're in a new era. We can't afford to manage shadow by projecting it out onto other people anymore, because we're gonna destroy ourselves as a culture if we do. And then
Mm.
I think also that, with the loss of religion over the last several decades, we are at a crisis of meaning.
Yeah.
And I think that Jungian thought absolutely addresses that.
Yeah. Yeah, I can see. So I really like to tap into different modalities, and the Jungian modality is really, for me, the connection with the spirit somehow.
Hmm. Hmm.
When I
Definitely.
think of that, it is really, but it's a connection with a individual spirit, not something, it's something that I can create for myself based on
Hmm.
some of the teachings that are present in the language. But also, it's interesting you mentioned Women Who Run with the Wolves, because it's what I'm reading, but
Oh,
I
okay.
can only I can only read that book because I kind of live the archetype as I'm reading it. So it's really hard to read that in one go. So I'm reading it for 3 years
Yeah,
already.
yeah. Yeah, it's a big book.
Yeah, I mean, but it's also, that's maybe another question, is the pace and the importance of finding one's pace in these processes, because we often, in the culture of scrolling in 30-second videos, it's quite hard to say, well, look, I was in this archetype for about a year.
Hmm.
I was, kind of, so maybe what was your allowing your own pace, and how did that look like for you?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, in some sense, I feel again like I might have let myself stay in a place for too long because it felt
Mm,
comfortable. And
mm,
so something about no, Lisa, it's you know, time's passing. You can stop being the nice girl and you
mm,
can maybe step into something different. So there's that side of it too.
mhm, Thank you for that's another important message I maybe
Yeah.
need to hear. And just in the interest of time, just want to check if there is anything that I haven't asked and you may want to, like, kind of have a burning desire to add.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, I think I almost going back to the part of the conversation where we were talking about victims or kind of the tendency we can all have to stay in that place too long. And sometimes therapy encourages us to do that, actually. One of the things I want to say about my new book, The Vital Spark, is I dip into that a little bit. And in some sense, what we talked about undergirds the whole book because I'm not so interested in why women might have a hard time finding their agency, for example. I mean, that's an interesting question, and it's not that I don't talk about it, but I'm much more interested in what we can do about it. And there's this wonderful concept that was not my concept. A friend mentioned it to me, and she'd heard about it from her therapist. I said, "You have to ask your therapist where that came from. I want to use it." So the therapist said, "I have no idea where it came from, but feel free to use it." And it's this idea of a worthy opponent. So
Mm,
when we're up against something in our life, whether it's a bad boss or a bad marriage or just any kind of difficult circumstance. And obviously, there are some circumstances that are so awful that they just completely overwhelm us. And I'm not talking about those. Again, it's not that, if you can't do it, it's your fault. Sometimes we can't do it. But it's a good question to ask is what would it look like to be a worthy opponent? What would I need to develop in myself to
mm.
address this situation?
How we would need to step up, what in us needs to grow to
Yeah.
become the worthy opponent.
Yes. Yes, yes. So, and whether or not that's accessing trickster energy or giving ourselves permission to speak from our anger or acknowledging our heart's desire or finding our ruthlessness or authority or any of these other things that I talk about in the book. So I wanted to kind of put that thought out there because I feel like that's a really powerful way to think about it.
Yeah, yeah. And it's a I think sometimes words are our best uh weapons, as but not in a way as carrying a weapon, but more like to be armed with good words and meaning making is almost something that it's
Hmm.
really a nice way to go at life.
Yes, it is. It is a nice way to go at life.
Yeah. And just to end on kind of, well, first, like, do you have any questions for me? Because I often ask that. Is there anything that you have sat with?
Well, there's probably a lot, but but maybe nothing that makes sense to ask at this point. So,
Okay. And so the rapid fire questions. One is, what kind of gifts do you like to give the most?
mhm. I do like to give consumable gifts because I think we all have a lot of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So I like to give soap if I think that that will be appreciated because I love things that smell nice and it's something that you can use, but then you don't have to try to find a place for it.
Mm. And then, is there an absurd thing about you that not many people know about? Meaning something that would not be in the archetype you present yourself in most.
Mm, mm. Um, no, I'm pretty boring. I guess I'm
Okay.
pretty boring. I really like, I really like, I really like frogs. How about that? I have a thing
Okay.
about frogs.
Okay. Okay, well, I want to really thank you for taking your time for I think also all the things you've created so that we
Mhm.
can grow and grow together, and also for doing the podcast so that we can get the really important information out, and for just
Mhm.
being you.
Well, thanks. I've really enjoyed this conversation. It's been very lively and we covered a lot of ground.
Yeah, thank you.